the ability to have somebody who is kind of epitomizes what you think your country stands for has always been a major ambition.
Inside Windsor Castle, a quiet operation unfolded beneath centuries of tradition, precise, deliberate, unstoppable. No ceremony marked it, no warning was announced. Yet at its center stood Prince William, and the monarchy's most unyielding enforcer, Princess Anne. What began as a restoration quickly revealed something far deeper, an irreversible shift tied to Diana, Princess of Wales's legacy. Was this tribute, or a calculated reckoning decades in the making? Because by the time Queen Camilla understood the truth, the outcome was already sealed, and nothing could stop what came next. What was really set in motion behind those palace walls? Drop your comment and subscribe, because the next revelation goes even deeper. The silent strategy that changed everything. What unfolded behind the walls of Windsor Castle was never meant to appear dramatic on the surface. From the outside, everything looked calm, controlled, and unchanged. There were no public signals, no official announcements, and no visible signs of tension within the institution. The royal environment continued its normal rhythm, giving the impression that nothing unusual was taking place. Yet beneath that carefully maintained stillness, a far more deliberate process was unfolding, one built with patience, precision, and complete control over detail. This was not the result of sudden emotion or a reaction to recent events. It was not something driven by impulse or pressure from the outside world. Instead, it was a structured operation that had been shaped slowly over time, designed in a way that ensured every stage would connect seamlessly to the next. Each part of the process was positioned with intention, moving toward a final point that would not allow reversal once reached. Nothing was left to chance, and nothing depended on spontaneity. At the center of this unfolding plan stood Prince William, operating with a level of focus that had developed over many years. His involvement was not symbolic or ceremonial in nature. It was grounded in a deeper objective that required discipline, patience, and above all, control over timing. Within the rigid structure of the monarchy, ideas alone hold little weight. What matters is the ability to transform intention into action through established authority. William understood this reality fully, and every step he took reflected that awareness. This is where Princess Anne became essential to the entire process. She was not simply supporting the direction of events. She became the mechanism through which the plan could actually function within the institution. Known for her strict discipline and unwavering respect for royal structure, Anne carried a form of institutional authority that did not need to be asserted publicly to be effective. Her influence operated through presence, process, and precision. Where William provided vision and emotional motivation, Anne provided structure that could carry that vision forward without resistance. Her role was not to disrupt the system, but to work entirely within it, ensuring that every requirement, every formality, and every procedural expectation was met in advance. This created a situation where nothing appeared unusual on the surface, even as the foundation beneath it was being carefully realigned. What followed was executed in complete silence. Approvals moved through channels without drawing attention. Access to sensitive areas was carefully managed to avoid disruption. Scheduling was arranged in a way that prevented scrutiny. Each movement was placed within existing protocol, each decision supported by precedent that made it difficult to question. There were no gaps left open for challenge, no loose ends that could be used to reverse direction later. Step by step, the structure tightened without ever revealing pressure. The system was not confronted directly. Instead, it was guided from within, using its own rules as the framework for change. By the time the final stage was reached, the outcome no longer depended on permission in the traditional sense. It had already been shaped into place long before anyone outside the process became aware of it. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of all was who remained outside this carefully constructed sequence. Queen Camilla was not simply unaware of developments as they unfolded. Her position within the process had been deliberately limited from the beginning. There were no mistakes in communication, no accidental exclusions, and no breakdowns in coordination. Her distance from the core decisions was intentional and embedded within the design of the operation itself. By the time everything converged inside Windsor Castle, there was no point at which intervention could realistically occur. No space remained for objection, and no opening existed for reversal. What had been set in motion had already passed the threshold where it could be undone. Everything, in effect, had already been decided. When every detail inside Windsor Castle converged without resistance, how did a decision already pass the point of reversal before anyone even realized it? If no intervention was possible, who truly controlled the moment that made everything irreversible long before it was declared? Let's find out. The return that could not be undone. By the time the groundwork had been quietly secured behind palace walls, the final act unfolded with striking speed. What appeared to be a simple adjustment inside Windsor Castle carried the weight of more than 20 years of absence. It was not announced. It was not debated. It simply happened, as though the moment had been waiting patiently for its time to arrive. Within the Hall of Matriarchs, a space that holds deep meaning in defining royal legacy, there had long been a silence that few could ignore. For decades, one presence had been missing from a place where history is carefully preserved and displayed. That absence, which began after 1997, had quietly shaped how the story of the monarchy was presented to those who walked those halls. And then, without warning, that silence was broken. The portrait of Diana, Princess of Wales, was brought forward and positioned with deliberate care. Not in a secondary location, not placed in the background, but set exactly where it had always been expected to stand. Beside Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history, a woman whose presence defines continuity and stability. The placement carried meaning that required no explanation. It spoke for itself in a language the institution has always understood. There was no suggestion of this being temporary, no indication that it was symbolic or subject to change. The decision carried a sense of permanence that could be felt in the room itself. This was not an adjustment that could be quietly reversed or reconsidered at a later time. It was final, set into place with the same certainty that defines every enduring tradition within the monarchy. What made the moment even more significant was how carefully it had been constructed behind the scenes. Every protocol had been observed with precision. Every historical guideline had been reviewed and respected. The positioning of portraits within that space follows rules shaped over generations, and in this case, those rules had not been challenged. They had been used step by step to support the outcome. Nothing had been left open to dispute. There was no procedural gap, no overlooked detail, no opportunity for objection to gain ground. This was not driven by impulse or emotion, even though emotion had always surrounded Diana's legacy. Instead, it reflected something far more calculated. It was the result of a long process reaching its conclusion. Each quiet decision made earlier had led to this exact point, where the final act would appear almost effortless, even though it had required years of careful preparation. Those present understood what they were witnessing, even if nothing was said aloud. A space that had once carried an absence now felt complete. A story that had been partially told was now being presented in full. And within that stillness, it became clear that this was not simply about restoring a portrait. It was about reshaping how the monarchy remembers one of its most significant figures, ensuring that her place within that history could no longer be questioned or removed. Those inside the room felt it instantly, even in silence. What once felt incomplete was suddenly whole again. But was this truly restoration, or a deeper rewriting of royal memory itself? And if so, who quietly decided history could never be questioned again? Stay with us. The moment control slipped away. What made the entire operation even more striking was not only what unfolded inside Windsor Castle, but the exact timing that shaped it from beginning to end. Every stage was positioned with careful precision, leaving no opening for interruption, no gap for delay, and no space for outside influence to disrupt the process. The timing itself felt engineered, as though every hour had been selected with intention rather than coincidence. During the final phase of the operation, Queen Camilla was not present in London. She was away attending a scheduled royal engagement, fully committed to duties that, on the surface, appeared routine and unconnected to anything unfolding behind palace walls. Her itinerary followed a structured calendar, one that looked ordinary and predictable, yet in hindsight seemed to align with unusual precision to the sequence of events taking place inside Windsor Castle. Nothing in her schedule suggested urgency or deviation, which made her absence from the center of activity even more significant in retrospect. While she remained engaged elsewhere, the operation inside Windsor reached its final conclusion. By the time she prepared to return, the atmosphere within the institution had already changed in a way that could not be reversed or paused. There was no gradual transition, no slow buildup of awareness or adjustment. Instead, the shift was immediate, absolute, and already complete by the time she crossed back into proximity with the core of royal decision-making. At the heart of that completed process stood the installation of the portrait of Diana, Princess of Wales, within the Hall of Matriarchs. This was not treated as an emerging development or an ongoing proposal. It had already been executed. The placement had been finalized with full precision, securing its position within a space that holds deep historical and symbolic importance. Alongside it, all supporting documentation had been completed, verified, and formally recorded within the institutional framework. Every required approval had already been processed, leaving no procedural steps unfinished and no administrative openings remaining. When the news finally reached Queen Camilla, the reaction was immediate and intense. The initial response came in the form of shock, sharp and disorienting, as the reality of what had taken place settled in. That shock quickly transformed into anger, driven by the need for explanation and clarity. From there, urgency took over. Questions were raised without hesitation, instructions were issued with firm authority, and demands for immediate clarification followed. Requests for meetings were made in rapid succession, each one aimed at understanding and potentially reversing what had already been completed. However, what followed marked a clear break from everything that had previously defined her influence within the royal structure. Each request, regardless of its form or urgency, did not receive negotiation or delay. Instead, it was met with firm and final refusal. There was no space for reconsideration, no pathway for escalation, and no indication that any part of the decision could be reopened. The responses came consistently, carrying the same quiet finality. No reversal would be made, no emergency review would be held, no intervention would be granted to alter what had already been established. For the first time in decades, the system did not bend in response to her position or authority. Within the structure she had long operated in, this moment revealed a deeper shift. The institution no longer responded to her direction in the way it once had. Instead, it remained fixed, aligned with a decision that had already been absorbed into its internal framework. What was unfolding was not a disagreement or temporary conflict. It was a structural closure, one that had already been set in place before any response could even begin. Inside those walls, the balance of influence had changed in a way that could be felt but not easily challenged. The channels of authority that were once accessible were no longer open. As that reality became undeniable, it was clear that what had occurred was not resistance in the usual sense. It was a complete and deliberate sealing of the process, built into the very structure of what had already been decided. Inside those royal walls, authority quietly shifted, and access suddenly closed. Was this simple resistance, or a deeper, deliberate sealing of power itself? As the institution hardened into silence, one question emerged: who truly decided this outcome, and what unseen force locked it in place forever? Keep watching. A promise carried through the years. As the reality of what had just unfolded began to settle within the walls of Windsor Castle, it became clear that this moment had not appeared out of nowhere. It was not sudden, and it was certainly not impulsive. What the world was witnessing was the final stage of something that had been quietly forming for years, shaped by memory, discipline, and an unwavering sense of purpose. For Prince William, the roots of this moment could be traced back to 1997. At just 15 years old, he walked behind the coffin of his mother, Diana, Princess of Wales, in a moment that would become one of the most powerful images in modern royal history. It was a moment defined by grief, but beneath that grief was something less visible and far more enduring. It was a quiet promise, one that did not need to be spoken aloud to shape the years that followed. As time passed, that promise did not fade. It changed form. It matured. What began as a deeply personal feeling slowly transformed into a clear sense of responsibility. William did not approach it with urgency or public emotion. Instead, he moved with patience. He observed. He learned. He began to understand the inner workings of the institution he was born into, recognizing that real change within the monarchy does not come from sudden action, but from careful preparation. Behind the scenes, that preparation took shape in ways few ever saw. There were quiet discussions with palace archivists, focused on understanding how history is preserved and presented. There were detailed reviews of protocols governing portrait placement, each rule studied to ensure that any future action would stand on firm ground. There was a steady effort to understand the limits of the institution, not to challenge them directly, but to work within them in a way that could not be easily undone. What made this effort so significant was its precision. William was not simply looking to honor his mother in a symbolic way. He was working towards something far more permanent. He wanted to ensure that her place within the royal narrative would be secured in a way that could not be quietly reversed or gradually diminished over time. Every step he took was guided by that objective. By the time the opportunity finally aligned, the foundation had already been laid, and standing beside him was Princess Anne, whose presence brought a level of authority that transformed preparation into action. With her support, the years of planning moved into their final phase, where intention met execution, and a promise carried since 1997 was finally given the strength to become reality within the very institution that had once allowed that absence to exist. What if the real turning point wasn't the decision itself, but the moment Princess Anne stepped in beside William, transforming decades of quiet planning since 1997 into something irreversible? Was this final intention becoming execution, or the beginning of a deeper shift inside the monarchy? Stay tuned. The silent architect behind the final placement. While the emotional weight of the entire operation rested heavily on Prince William's long-held promise, the true structure that carried it to completion was shaped elsewhere, in quieter hands and colder precision. Princess Anne became the figure around whom everything ultimately aligned, not through public declaration, but through disciplined control that left no room for uncertainty. From the earliest stages of the final execution inside Windsor Castle, she was involved in the most sensitive layers of the process. Her focus was not on symbolism, but on structure. Every detail that could affect the outcome was reviewed through her oversight. Timing had to be exact, access had to be controlled, personnel had to be carefully positioned, and every possible point of disruption had to be removed before it could form. There was no space for error, and under her watch, none was allowed to surface. What made her role so decisive was the way she approached the entire act. It was never treated as something ceremonial or open to interpretation. Instead, it was handled as a correction to the historical record already in place within the institution. This framing changed everything about how the process moved forward. It was no longer about adding something new, but about restoring something that was believed to have been misplaced in the structure of royal memory. As the portrait of Diana, Princess of Wales, was carefully brought into position within the Hall of Matriarchs, the atmosphere shifted into complete stillness. Those present did not respond with visible emotion or outward reaction. There was no applause or formality attached to the moment. Instead, there was a shared understanding that something final had been reached. The placement carried a weight that did not require explanation, because the symbolism had already been fully absorbed by the space itself. Every movement leading to that point had been shaped by precision, and nothing was left unaccounted for. The positioning beside Queen Elizabeth II was not accidental, nor was it symbolic in a temporary sense. It reflected a deliberate alignment within the historical narrative of the monarchy, placing Diana's image within a space reserved for enduring legacy and continuity. In that silence, Princess Anne's role became unmistakable. She was not reacting to the moment, she was finalizing it. According to those who understood the gravity of the situation, it was at this point that she gave voice to what had been carefully implied throughout the process, but never formally stated within the institution. In a simple, unembellished acknowledgement, she affirmed that Diana belonged in that space. not as a distant memory preserved by time, but as a permanent part of the monarchy's ongoing legacy. That statement did not introduce new meaning. It confirmed what had already been structurally decided. In that silence, Princess Anne didn't react. She finalized everything. Then came the moment no one expected, a quiet statement that sealed Diana's place forever. But was it truly just confirmation, or the hidden signal that something far bigger inside the monarchy had already been set in motion? Stay glued. The moment power stopped responding. Following the completion of the placement inside Windsor Castle, the atmosphere within the royal environment did not settle into comfort or resolution. Instead, it tightened into something more uncertain, where authority was no longer measured by position alone, but by response, and in this case, response itself began to disappear. Queen Camilla, faced with the full reality of what had taken place, moved quickly to seek reversal. The situation, from her perspective, required immediate attention from the highest level of authority within the monarchy. She turned directly to King Charles III, the one figure who had consistently stood as her strongest institutional support over the years. In moments of public pressure and internal criticism, he had often been the stabilizing force that ensured her position remained secure within the structure of the crown. That history made the moment even more significant. The expectation, shaped by years of precedent, was that intervention would follow. A correction, a pause, or at the very least a formal review of the decision that had just been finalized inside Windsor Castle. Everything about the established pattern suggested that the situation would not be left unaddressed. But what followed broke from that expectation completely. King Charles III did not object. He did not challenge the development. He did not issue any instruction to reverse or reconsider the actions that had already been carried out. There was no formal response that indicated disagreement, and no visible effort made to alter the outcome that had already been secured through the internal structure of the institution. Instead, there was silence. Not the kind of silence that suggests hesitation, but one that carried the weight of finality. Within the context of royal decision-making, silence is never without meaning. It reflects position, alignment, and in many cases, the acceptance of what has already moved beyond the point of negotiation. For Queen Camilla, this absence of intervention marked a turning point that could not be ignored. The expected chain of support did not activate. The protective structure she had relied on did not engage. What remained was a system already in motion, continuing forward without interruption or correction. In choosing not to act, King Charles III did not simply remain neutral. His inaction became the defining factor in how the situation settled. By withholding intervention, he effectively allowed the outcome to remain unchanged. The restoration of Diana's presence within the Hall of Matriarchs, already completed through earlier stages of preparation, now stood without opposition from the highest level of authority. The balance that had long existed within the royal framework shifted quietly but completely. No announcement marked the change. No formal declaration confirmed it. Yet within the structure itself, the absence of resistance carried more weight than any direct decision could have expressed. What had been set in motion was no longer dependent on approval. It now existed through acceptance, even if that acceptance came only in silence. The royal balance didn't just shift, it silently collapsed into something new, without a single announcement or resistance. But if no one officially approved it, who truly gave the crown permission to change everything? And what larger power was already steering that silence from behind the palace walls? The quiet rebalancing of the crown. After the silence that followed King Charles III's decision not to intervene, the effects of that moment did not remain contained within Windsor Castle. Instead, they began to spread gradually through the wider structure of the monarchy, shaping behavior, roles, and visibility in ways that were subtle at first, but increasingly noticeable with time. What unfolded was not a sudden shift, but a steady transition that revealed itself through patterns rather than announcements. Within this evolving atmosphere, Catherine, Princess of Wales, began to take on a more visible and central presence in royal duties. Her appearances were not framed as replacements or direct continuations of anyone else's legacy, but the nature of her engagements began to reflect areas long associated with Diana, Princess of Wales. Public service initiatives, particularly those connected to children, emotional well-being, and community support, started to receive renewed attention under her influence. At the same time, organizations and charitable efforts that had once been strongly linked to Diana's public identity began to reappear in a more active form. These were not loud relaunches or heavily promoted changes. Instead, they were quiet reactivations, carefully integrated back into the rhythm of royal work. The messaging surrounding these initiatives also began to shift, with language and focus increasingly aligning with themes of compassion, care, and long-term social impact. This transformation extended beyond charity work into royal engagements themselves. The selection of events, the structure of appearances, and the individuals representing the crown in public settings began to reflect a new balance. The changes were not abrupt enough to draw immediate confrontation, but they were consistent enough to be recognized. Over time, they formed a clear pattern of recalibration within the monarchy's public identity. In contrast, Queen Camilla's presence within these key royal moments began to change in a different way. It was not marked by removal or public exclusion, but by a gradual reduction in visibility. Fewer references were made in certain contexts, and her participation in central engagements appeared less frequent than before. The shift was not presented as a demotion, nor was it framed through official language of change. Instead, it took shape through absence, through the spaces where she was no longer as prominently positioned. Within the structure of the institution, this was understood as repositioning rather than elimination. Her role still existed, but its placement within the broader framework of royal activity had been adjusted. The hierarchy remained intact on the surface, yet the distribution of attention and symbolic weight had clearly evolved. What emerged from all of this was not simply a correction of past narratives, but a deeper redefinition of direction. The monarchy, through a series of controlled and carefully aligned developments, was no longer focused solely on preserving its historical structure. It was actively reshaping how that history would be carried forward, deciding which elements would remain central and which would gradually move to the background of its evolving identity. So, what do you think truly defined this royal shift? Anne's control, William's promise, or Charles's silence behind Diana's permanent reinstatement? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.